American Student Ministries, in conjunction with the Youth Ministries Department of Western Bible College, presents Dawson McAllister, with straight talk about how to get along with your parents. Praise music composed and led by Doug Hanks. Produced by National Cable Television Institute.
Try that verse again, okay? Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and until the end of time, He'll remain that way. He'll never go away. No, He'll never go away. In His Word, it's understood that He will always stay, and He'll never go away.
In this particular section, I want to talk to you about the most important area of your life. Outside of your relationship with God, I couldn't think of a more important area for you to deal with than your relationship with your parents. Your relationship with your parents will greatly affect your happiness or lack of it. Several years ago, I was in New Jersey. I was doing a classroom. There's about 10 to 12 kids around me, and they were all spellbound. I was speaking on the subject of love, sex, and dating, except for one kid. He was way off in the corner. He wasn't listening. Sometimes he'd sort of fade away, and then sometimes he would look out the window, and he was wanting me to know that he was not listening to me. Well, after the class was over, I went back to this kid who was still sitting there. I said, "I don't think I've met you. My name's Dawson. What's yours?" And I reached out to shake his hand. He mumbled something that his name was Dave. I said, "Dave, I noticed you weren't real intent on what I was having to say. Are you feeling okay?" He said, "Yeah, I'm fine." He said, "I'm just a little bit tired." I said, "Well, Dave," I said, "do you have a free hour now?" In some classes, you know, you have this free, in school you have these free hours, like an hour to vandalize the neighborhood before you go on to the... I said, and he said, "Yeah, I have a free hour." I said, "I'd like to go with you." He said, "Okay." I said, "I want to spend some time with you." He said, "Okay." So we went down to where he stood around the cloud of blue. You have a place like that in your school? Big cloud of blue, and everybody have a nicotine fit just walking down the hallway. And I said something to him rather blunt. I said, "Dave," I said, "I noticed something about you." He said, "What's that?" I said, "I noticed you never smile." I said, "Why don't you smile?" He said, "My dad." He said, "I hate my dad." He said, I swear to God, he still thinks Roosevelt's president. I think he just got off the boat. He said, I hate my dad. Well, to make a short story as long as possible, I spent 12 hours with him that entire weekend. I wanted to get to know him. Found out he was selling cocaine. He'd run away from his father and his mother. And I shared with him Christ. He never did respond to Christ. But I'll tell you one thing. In those 12 hours that I spent with him, he never smiled. Never smiled. I have yet to meet a high school student who's hassling with their parents and still happy. If you are hassling with your parents, you're not happy. And yet if you were to survey your friends, they would tell you in so many words, what do you want most of all? I want to be happy. How to get along with your parents. Your relationship with your parents, as you can see on page 1, greatly affects many areas of your life. Look at this. It can affect the way you view yourself. Did you know that your self-image is basically, up until your 7th or 8th grade, was formed by your parents? Do you know that? What you think about yourself? It'll affect your relationship with your friends. You will find that basically your friends feel the same way about their parents as you do. So if you're angry with your parents, most likely you will try to find people who are also angry with their parents to run around with. It'll affect your studies. Did you know a study was done on studies a while back? That's right. And they found out that if you have a major exam and have a fight with your parents the same day, you'll get 1 grade point lower. And most of you cannot afford that. No. It'll affect your date life. It'll affect your future. It'll affect your peace of mind. And then look at this dot, the last dot on page 1. You might want to underline this. Most students do not seem to understand how greatly their relationship with God is affected by their relationship with their parents. Did you know that? That your relationship with God is greatly affected by your relationship with your parents? In fact, look at the next paragraph there. Here's a simple rule that is almost always true. Here's the rule. If you won't get along with your parents, you won't get along with God. Repeat after me. If you won't get along with your parents,
You won't get along with God.
if you won't get along with your parents,
You won't get along with God.
that's a simple and almost always true rule. Now you can see on page 2 here that we have several questions we'd like to ask you. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest and 10 the highest, rate your overall relationship with your parents. Would it be a 3? Would it be a 5? Would it be a 2? 1 being the worst, 10 being the greatest. How would you rank your relationship with your parents? And there's a couple other questions here. Look at the last dot, and then we'll go back to the second dot. Over what issues do you and your parents fight? And then the heavy question, what do you think needs to happen for your relationship with your parents to rank a 10? What needs to be changed? If you could change your relationship with your parents, what would it be? Okay? All right, who'd like to answer, first of all, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest, 10 being the highest, your relationship with your parents? Who'd like to tell me what you put down? Anybody? Yes, you.
9.5.
Can't hear you.
9.5.
Your relationship with your parents, is it as between a 9 and a 10? God will forgive you for lying. Okay, no, just kidding. Over what issues do you and your parents fight?
Car.
Pardon?
The car.
What? Explain that to me.
My mother's car, my using it and wanting to do things with my friends and go places and so forth. And her wanting to keep it just in case she needs it.
Okay, we fight over the car. You want it 95% of the time, and she wants it 95% of the time. And that's more than 100%. Yes! Who else would like to share something? On 1 to 10. All right, who else? 1 to 10? Yeah, you in the black.
5.
You're a 5. Okay, that's not too bad. It's pretty honest. Over what do you and your parents disagree, fight, have hassles?
Mostly hair and clothes.
Hair and clothes. Well, as some older men will tell you, hair today, gone tomorrow. But, you know, that's okay. What do they say about your hair?
They said they don't like it.
Too long?
Yeah. And they don't like the style. They said you're out of style. I tell them I don't care.
That really helps the conversation progress. You're out of style. I don't care. I mean, what do you do with that, you know? Who else has a problem? Or, you know, you want to answer this. On a scale of 1 to 10, you in the blue in the back there. Pressure's on.
Okay. It's about me.
An 8. Okay, that's great. Tell me about it. Tell me, even though it's an 8, it could be a 10, correct?
Good.
Yeah. Over what do you have hassles when you do have hassles?
Well, mostly over religion, really.
Really? Explain that to me.
Well, I'm sort of like a fundamental, undenominational. My dad's a Mormon, so we can kind of get hassles once in a while. He lets me go my way, and I kind of, let him go his way.
Okay, what would your relationship need to improve? What would it take? What changes would have to be made for you to go from an 8, did you say an 8? You did say an 8 to a 10.
Probably just a willingness to open up with him, tell him my most intimate feelings. Sometimes people hold back from their parents what they really feel.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later. Okay, what we're really talking about as we turn to page 3 is absolutely critical. Repeat after me. If you won't get along with your parents, you won't get along with God. That's why it's so important that even though you're at an 8, you really want to get to a 10. You're at a 4 with your father, you need to get to a 10. If you're at a 5, you need to get to a 10. You said you were at an 8, goes to a 10. Whatever it is, we want to work on this. You know why? Because if you won't get along with your parents, you won't get along with God. If you don't get along with God, what's life? I'm going to give you 4 concepts in this first session. If you can master these 4 concepts, you are on your way to making an incredible improvement in your relationship with your parents. To begin with, we need to understand concept number 1. We need to understand what an authority figure is. Oh yes, the dirty word, authority figure. Let's talk about that. What is an authority figure? Don't look at your notes. Don't look at the book. Just answer from the top of your head. Give me a definition of an authority figure. Anybody? Yes?
Someone that's older than you.
Someone that's older than you.
That you respect.
That you respect. Okay, that's a start. Most authority figures are older than you. Yes?
Someone who has some amount of control over you and things that you do.
Someone who has control over you. That's good. Now we're on a roll now. Who else would like to work on a definition? Yes?
Someone you're supposed to obey.
Someone you're supposed to obey. Now we're really getting hot. Anybody else? Yes?
Someone that God has set over us.
Oh my goodness. Let's take a look at this. Now let's look at the definition. I think we have it. An authority figure is God. Would you say God's an authority figure? Probably one of the bigger ones, huh? An authority figure is God and others He puts into our lives who have the power to tell us what to do and the power to enforce what they say. Yes, that is an authority figure. Look what God says about authority figures. Romans 13:1. Let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities. There's the big word. For there is no what? Authority except from God, and those which exist are established by who? God. God's into the authority business. Turn the page. Now you can see on page 4 here, there are all kinds of authority figures in our lives. And who is the greatest authority figure in our lives? God. Yes, He ranks way above. In the art, we should have had God, big G, big O, big D. The greatest authority figure in all the universe is God. Then comes your father. Remember him? Like to forget, right? And your mother. Then comes your teacher. Have a few of those, don't you? Then your employer, better known as your boss. Then here comes the meanest one of all, your youth worker. Yes. Hey. Then you have the government. Then you have the police. Remember them? We're not talking about a rock group either. Then we're talking about the judge. Then we're talking about the probation officer. And then we're talking about the warden. Yes. Those are all authority figures. And all of us have authority figures. That makes sense, doesn't it? We all have authority figures. Now, we don't have time now, but when we break into our small groups, you might want to answer this question. Can you, by personal name, list some of the authority figures in your life? But let's move ahead. Page 5. So we need to understand, our authority figures are friends or enemies? Anybody? Friends. They may not look like friends, but God says they are your friends because they are God's tool in our lives to make us be what He wants us to be, an authority figure. Now we need to understand concept number 2, or B, on page 5. We need to understand what the wrong kind of pride is. See, we're all stricken. Now this is how we get in trouble with our parents. We are all wiped out by the wrong kind of pride. What does pride say? What is the wrong kind of pride? You can see it right there in the text. The wrong kind of pride says that we don't need anyone telling us what to do. Rather, we should be our own authority figure. Yes, yes. We do not need God. We don't need father or mother. We do not need the government. We don't need the police. We don't need the warden. We certainly don't need the youth pastor. We will be our own authority figure. And by the way, who was the first one to get caught up in the wrong kind of pride? Satan himself. That's correct. Look right there in Isaiah 14, verses 12 through 14. God speaking to Satan. Look at this. How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. You have been cut down to the earth, you who have weakened the nations. But you said in your heart, here comes his ego problem, I will ascend to heaven. He's not going to ask for permission. He's just going to go right into the very presence of God anytime he wants to. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. That's where God sits. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. Now look at this big line. I will make myself like the Most High. Now how could Satan make himself like the Most High? I mean, Satan's not God. God can be everywhere at once. Can Satan? No. God knows everything. Does Satan know everything? No. Only God is God. But he says, I will make myself like the Most High. Now, how could he be like the Most High? I'll tell you why. Here's how it happens. God only answers to himself. Does that make sense? David said, our God's in heaven. He does what he pleases. God has no authority figure over him. Make sense? Satan says, I will be like the Most High. I will be my own God. I will answer to no one but me. That got him a dust sandwich. And there's been chaos ever since. The only problem is we are stuck with pride too. We don't like to admit that we need anybody in our lives but ourselves. It's a terrible, terrible tragedy. First concept we need to understand is concept what? Authority figure. What's the second concept? Concept of pride. Here's the third concept. Page 6. Page 6, point C. We need to understand what rebellion is all about. Now look at the script there. The wrong kind of pride says, I don't need authority figures. Rebellion says, I will resist and disobey anyone in authority who tries to tell me what to do. Get it? Pride says, I don't need you. Rebellion says, I will fight you if you try to get in my way and tell me what to do. Now we can see rebellion very quickly shown in the garden. Now you know the story about the Garden of Eden, right? Beautiful garden. There was Adam and Eve walking with God. They didn't have a sin nature. They were walking, and God gave them a test. He said, okay, see the garden, all the fruit in this garden, see all the trees in this garden? They did. He said, you can eat out of any tree in this garden, but there's one tree I don't want you to touch. God was going to test to see whether or not they would obey him. You touch that tree, that fruit, well, you can see it right there in the script there on page 6, 2/3 of the way down. But from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it, you shall surely die. Now let's look and see what happens. Here's Adam and Eve in the garden. Along comes Satan. Satan already has a pride problem. Satan already has a rebellion problem, and now he's going to try to pass it on. Take a look at this. Now the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field, which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, indeed has God said, you shall not eat from the tree of the garden. And the woman said to the serpent, from the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat from it or touch it, lest you die. Now watch this. And the serpent said to the woman, you surely shall not die. That was a blatant lie. We've been dying ever since, haven't we? And the serpent said to the woman, you surely shall not die. For God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like who? God, knowing good and evil. Satan said to Eve, now listen to me. Satan said to Eve, hey, God's trying to shaft you. He wants to have control over you. Now, if you will just disobey what he says and eat from that fruit, you can be like who? God. You can answer to yourself. She rebelled. She said, I'm going to resist God for trying to tell me what to do. He said, don't do it. Well, I'm going to do it. And chaos set in. Now, because of that, and there's questions on page 7 which we can talk about in our small groups, but because of that, man has been in chaos ever since. Why are there wars today? Anybody know? Pride, rebellion. Why will between 13 and 20 high school students commit suicide between now and tomorrow at this time? Pride, and rebellion. Why are we getting older every day and going to die someday? Of course, we know Christ will go on to heaven, but why are we going to die physically anyway? Pride and rebellion. Remember, you can't make peace with your parents unless you understand authority figures, pride, rebellion. Some of us are just saturated with rebellion. And we certainly cannot understand how to get along with our parents unless we understand the concept of submission. You can see there on page 8. What is submission? Submission is when we willfully and joyously obey and heed the instruction of authority figures. Notice we say willfully. Notice we say joyously. Heed the instruction and the authority of authority figures. Now, King David was an example of this. You know the story of King David? Remember Saul? Head and shoulders over anybody else, children of Israel. Children of Israel said, we want a king. God said, no, I'll be your king. They said, we want a king, we want a king. God said, no, I'll be your king. They said, we want a king, we want a king. God said, okay, I'll give you a king, but you won't like having a king. And who did he choose? A man named Saul. Big dude, 6'6", 6'7". The Bible said he was head and shoulders over anybody else. He looked the part. But Saul made an incredible error. He had a pride problem and a rebellion problem. And instead of trusting God, what did he do? He turned to witchcraft. He turned to demons to get his counsel. He turned to mediums. And so when Saul turned to his medium, you know what happened? God said, that's it, Saul, you're out of the pool, which means, that's it. I'm going to choose another king. And who did God choose? Next guy, David. What happened was when God chose David, this is incredible, David was just a teenager. In fact, he hadn't shaved yet. Looks like late junior high, early junior high, somewhere in there. That's all he was. But what happened was, as you know, David became a great warrior. And the people begin to say, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. And Saul became jealous towards David, and he decided that he would kill David. Saul was not dealing with a full spiritual deck, and he decided that he would kill David. And what he did was, he took 3,000 of his top soldiers to chase David into the mountains. Now, if you were David, wouldn't you want to kill Saul? I mean, you know, self-defense, right? They're out to kill him. Well, let's take a look at this incredible story to talk about submission. Now, it came about when Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines. We're on page 8 there. Now, it came about when Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines. He was told, saying, behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men. David had a ragtag group of men with him. In front of the rocks of the wild goats. That means they were high up, folks. Yes. And he came to the sheepfolds on the way, and there was a cave. And Saul went in to relieve himself. Isn't the Bible a realistic book? Saul had to go to the bathroom. And Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the inner recesses of the cave, right where Saul's going to go in and relieve himself. Not sitting too far, hiding in the cave. Wouldn't you know it is David and his men. Very interesting setup we have here. And the men of David said to him, behold, this is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I am about to give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you. Yea, verily, verily, slit his throat. I read that in. Then David arose and cut off the edge of Saul's robe secretly. And it came about afterward that David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the edge of Saul's robe. So he said to his men, far be it from me because of the Lord that I should do this to my Lord, this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. And David persuaded his men with these words, and did not allow them to rise up against Saul. And Saul arose, left the cave, and went on his way. Now look on page 9, the plot thickens. Now afterward, David arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, saying, see, he gets far enough away from Saul, and then he yells out, hey, Saul! Evidently he was up on a high rock, and Saul was down below, and there wasn't anything King Saul could do. And David said to Saul, why do you listen to the words of men, saying, behold, David seeks to harm you? Verse 10, behold, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord had given you today into my hands in the cave. And some said to kill you, but my eyes had pity on you. And I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Verse 11, now my fathers see the edge of your robe in my hand. For in that I cut off the edge of your robe and did not kill you. Know and perceive that there is no evil or what? Rebellion in my hands. And I have not sinned against you, though you are lying in wait for my life to take it. May the Lord judge between you and me. May the Lord avenge me on you. But my hand shall not be against you. This is incredible. David said, Saul, I will not kill you. I have determined not to kill you because you are the Lord's what? Anointed. I want to share something with you. Your parents are God's anointed in your life. They're not perfect. We'll talk about that next session. They are not perfect. Far from being perfect. Was Saul perfect? No, he was into witchcraft. Plus, he was trying to kill David. But David still said, you are the Lord's what? Anointed. And to kill him would have been to do what against the Lord? Do evil and do what? Rebel. Okay, now let's wrap this baby up. Look on page 10. I'm now going to prove the point that if you won't get along with your parents, you won't get along with God. What's the first concept we need to understand? The concept of what? That's anyone that God has put in his life, in your life. That's anyone that God has put in your life who has the power and the authority to tell you what to do. We need to understand the wrong kind of pride. The wrong kind of pride says, I don't want anyone telling me what to do. We need to understand rebellion. Rebellion says, I will resist and disobey anyone in authority who tries to tell me what to do. We need to understand submission. Submission is when we willfully and joyously obey and heed the instruction of authority figures. Here's the big wrap-up. Therefore, we will not be submissive towards our parents who are authority figures. We will not be submissive towards God. One time my father had a counseling session with a woman. She was about 35. She said this, she said, I could never take an order from my father, and now I find it very difficult to take any orders from God. Look what the Bible says in Romans 13, verses 1 and 2. Let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God. We've read this earlier, but look at it. And those which exist are established by God. Now, look at the next punchline. Therefore, he who resists authority has opposed the laws of God, the ordinance of God. And they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. See it? There it is. Repeat after me. If you won't get along with your parents, you won't get along with your parents. You won't get along with God. You won't get along with God. A student comes to my office and says, I'm angry with my parents. I ask them several questions. Number one, do you want to make peace with your parents? Well, I'm not sure. Do you want to make peace with God? Because if you do one, you have to do the other. If you do the other, you have to do the one. Does that make sense? All right, now let's look at the discussion questions very quickly, for which we want to break into small groups. They're on page 11. Can you give the personal names of the authority figures in your life? Can you explain some times when you were prideful and rebellious towards an authority figure? How did that affect your relationship with God? Who is the toughest authority figure for you to be submissive to, and why? Explain a time when you were submissive to authority figures. How did that affect your relationship with God? And then the tough one. If you won't get along with your parents, you won't get along with God. Let's break into small groups.